The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also referred to as the JCPOA or Iran nuclear deal, is without a doubt one of the most important items on today's international stage. Despite the campaign promise by US President Joe Biden to re-enter the deal, which Trump left in 2018, that hasn't come to fruition. A diplomatic stalemate has ensued between Iran and the United States, with each side insisting the other take the first step in order to revive the agreement. Let's take a closer look at where the deal currently stands. I'm Richard Medhurst, and you're watching the Communiqué. The JCPOA was signed in Vienna in 2015 between Iran, the European Union, and the P5+1, meaning Britain, the United States, France, China, Russia, and Germany. The deal sought to reduce Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief and the unfreezing of assets. Now, before we go any further, I can't believe I have to say this, but it's important to note that a nuclear program is not the same thing as a nuclear weapons program, right? Yes, you need one in order to get the other. However, people often conflate the two when they are absolutely not the same thing. Iran has a nuclear program meant for civilian use, like energy and research purposes. However, Iran does not have a nuclear weapons program, despite what Netanyahu, Joe Biden, and the mainstream media claim. Now, despite the nuclear deal being heralded as one of the greatest diplomatic breakthroughs in recent modern history, the Trump administration pulled out of the agreement in May 2018. Trump insisted that it was a terrible deal that supposedly didn't go far enough. Israel had always been critical of the deal since the beginning, and Trump proceeded to repeat many of the same tropes, that the JCPOA didn't go far enough because it didn't include any limits on Iran's ballistic missiles or so-called malign activities in the region, meaning Iran's support for the legitimate resistant movements of Palestine, Lebanon, and other allies in the region like Iraq and Syria. Iran had been fully compliant with the nuclear deal, confirmed by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, which is the UN's nuclear watchdog. Despite this, Trump left the agreement, and afterwards he went on to reimpose the very sanctions that the deal sought to alleviate in the first place as part of his maximum pressure campaign. The Trump regime targeted Iran's banking and oil sectors, which severely impacted Iran's oil exports, its economy, and its public health infrastructure. As we've seen before on the program, sanctions are no joke. Sanctions literally kill people and hurt civilians most of all. In response to the United States' abrupt departure from the nuclear deal, Iran, as a result, began to exceed the limits imposed on its nuclear program by invoking a dispute resolution mechanism within the nuclear deal. Article 36 of the JCPOA clearly states that if Iran believes any or all of the parties are not meeting their commitments, Iran can refer the issue to the Joint Commission, followed by the Ministers of Foreign Affairs, and then the Advisory Board for resolution. If the issue still hasn't been resolved, and the complaining participant deems the issue to constitute significant non-performance, then that participant could treat the unresolved issue as grounds to cease performing its commitments under the JCPOA in whole or in part, and or notify the UN Security Council, which is exactly what happened. That's what the United States did. The United States left the deal, which constitutes non-performance. Article 37 of the JCPOA clearly goes on to say that, quote, Iran has stated that if sanctions are reinstated in whole or in part, Iran will treat that as grounds to cease performing its commitments under this JCPOA in whole or in part. And again, that's precisely what the US did after leaving the deal. It reimposed sanctions on Iran. So when Iran decided to increase the number of centrifuges or enrich uranium past the limit of 3.67%, this was a tit-for-tat response to the United States, which is perfectly in line with the agreement. It's an integral part of the agreement, not a violation. Nonetheless, the media continue to lie and say that Iran is breaching the deal when it's clearly not. It's following the deal to the letter. During his presidential campaign, Joe Biden said that if he were elected, the United States would rejoin the nuclear deal, which was drawn up when he was vice president under Barack Obama. However, it's been 2 months now since Biden took office in January 2021, and there doesn't seem to be much progress at all. As a matter of fact, all we've seen is a continued game of tiptoeing around the issue and expecting Iran to go first. Now, Iran wants the United States to lift sanctions and return to the deal, The United States says it wants Iran to comply first with the deal and go back to the original limits of the JCPOA. Again, what the United States says here makes no sense. Iran has been complying with the deal for years, as confirmed by the UN's nuclear watchdog, the IAEA. Even after Trump pulled out of the deal, Iran continued to comply with the agreement. When Trump left the deal in 2018, Iran waited until May 8th the following year to announce that unless sanctions on its banking sector and oil sector were lifted, Iran would resume stockpiling excess uranium and heavy water used in its nuclear reactors. Ironically, just days before, the United States itself had halted the renewal of waivers which would have allowed Iran to sell off its excess enriched uranium in order to keep the stockpiles low in the first place. The most recent development occurred in December 2020 when Iran's parliament, the Mejlis, passed a law titled the Strategic Action Plan to Lift Sanctions and Protect Iranian Nation's Interests. Under Article 6, the law stipulates that if within 2 months' time the remaining parties to the JCPOA did not offer sanctions relief, Iran would cease to abide by the additional protocol. This means that Iran would continue to abide by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but only under the basic safeguards agreement and without offering additional access to IAEA inspectors under this additional protocol. The time frame of 2 months is no accident. It's important to note this because it was offering a chance to then President-elect Biden to re-enter the deal and fix this matter. So as per the law passed by the Iranian parliament, Iran informed the IAEA that it would stop implementing the voluntary transparency measures as of February 23rd. The Director General of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, then rushed to Tehran and held an emergency meeting, and he reached a compromise. He reached a deal, a temporary deal, where Iran would implement a so-called black box system. So the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, this is the basis of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, this would continue as normal. And also the IAEA would continue its necessary verification and monitoring activities for up to 3 months. If by then Iran obtains some form of sanctions relief, the IAEA would then be allowed to access this information. But if not, it would be destroyed. This reduced cooperation doesn't mean that Iran will be kicking out IAEA inspectors like some sensationalist headlines in the mainstream media. Yes, there will be reduced cooperation, but it still leaves the door open for the United States to do the right thing and reverse the Trump-era sanctions. As Iranian Foreign Minister Javed Zarif said recently in an interview with Politico, quote, if the United States wants to go back to the deal, it has to follow the same order that we started. It has to now come back to compliance. As soon as the United States comes to compliance, Iran will comply. This is as easy as that. We'll be right back after this short break. To discuss the latest developments of the Iran nuclear deal, I'm joined by Scott Ritter. He was a United Nations weapons inspector in Iraq from 1991 to 1998, as well as a major and an intelligence officer in the Marine Corps. He was a staunch opponent of the Iraq War and one of the few people who actually stood up to the Bush regime and called out its lies about weapons of mass destruction. Thanks for coming on, Scott. It's a privilege to have you.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
What are your thoughts so far on this dance that we're seeing between the Biden administration and Iran about who goes first, right? The U.S. wants Iran to comply with the original limits of the JCPOA, and Iran wants the U.S. to re-enter the JCPOA and lift sanctions first. So what is your take on that, generally speaking, to start off with?
The U.S. never intended for Iran to have a viable, functioning, unconstrained nuclear enrichment program. President Obama all but admits this. He admitted in 2015 that the JCPOA was basically designed to buy time. So the JCPOA was never meant to succeed, and I will say that one more time. The JCPOA was never meant to succeed. It was meant to buy time in hopes that by lifting economic sanctions and engaging with Iran economically, that the United States and its European allies might be able to get Iran to see the wisdom of backing away from its nuclear program, doing away with its enrichment program, and thereby meeting the national security objectives of not only the United States, but Israel, which is a major player in the background here. Israel does not want Iran to have a nuclear enrichment program because Israel interprets this program as being an important element of a nuclear weapons program. Israel is right. I mean, you can't have a nuclear weapon without a nuclear enrichment program. But what Israel doesn't take into account is that Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Article 4 of that treaty allows Iran to have a nuclear enrichment program without restrictions, and Iran is simply complying and has always complied with its obligations in this regard. But one needs to understand that the Biden administration has inherited an Obama-era policy of not allowing the JCPOA to succeed. And if Biden rejoins the JCPOA, he will be creating the conditions of legitimizing an agreement that the United States has never believed to be legitimate. And Iran knows this, and that's why Iran realizes that it has to toe the line. It can't show flexibility. It must insist on the full return of the United States, thereby certifying the JCPOA as a valid international agreement. The Biden administration, everybody's saying, well, maybe they'll rejoin. They will never rejoin. It is not their policy objective to rejoin, because to rejoin would be to certify that which they disdain.
We're hearing a lot of the same tropes from Biden's team that we heard from Trump, that we heard from the Israelis, that, this isn't just about Iran's nuclear program or Iran potentially building a nuke. No, it's also about Iran's, quote, activities in the region and their ballistic missiles program. I mean, do you get a sense that that's their ultimate goal and it's more about kneecapping Iran's defenses? Would you say that's an accurate assessment?
Look, it's always been that way. Even under the Obama administration, the entering of the JCPOA was supposed to be, an entree into broader diplomatic discussions about Iran's so-called malign activities in the region, its support of Hezbollah, its support of the regime of Bashar al-Assad, the support, I should say government, I got to be careful with semantics here, support of the Houthi of Yemen, who are defending themselves from Saudi aggression, and their activities in Afghanistan, which, they've been vehemently opposed to the Taliban, and they've always sought to get some sort of post-Taliban stability in Afghanistan. These are malign activities. We're also opposed to Iran having a viable military deterrence. That Iran today has a whole boatload of very precise ballistic missiles that can rain death and destruction down on American military facilities and the economic facilities of our regional allies, destroying everything. Iran will never give up this deterrence. But this is the fact. People can criticize Donald Trump, and I have. He's the most honest president we've ever had about our policy toward Iran, because he's just right up front about it. He said, no, this is a bad deal. We're never going to allow Iran to have a nuclear enrichment program. We're going to sanction the heck out of them until they back away. But there would be no yielding on that. It's bad policy, but it's honest policy, as opposed to the Biden administration, which continued to promulgate the lie that it was going to rejoin the JCPOA, knowing all along that it would never do so unless Iran was willing to open the door to follow-on negotiations that would dilute the JCPOA, dilute Iran's regional influence.
All these things that you just pointed out, we understand that they're an effective deterrent, and they're non-nuclear. So we understand that from a military point of view. I was hoping if you could also expand on it from a scientific, from a technical point of view, why it's just simply impossible that Iran has a nuke or is seeking to build a nuke.
People don't respect the fact that Iran is an Islamic republic, and that first term means a lot. Iran, where the leader is the supreme jurisprudent, where he is not only the leader of the nation, he's their religious authority. This carries the power. This is like the Pope, for the Catholicism. The Pope isn't going to get up and start spouting lies, because that'll be the end of Catholicism. The leader isn't going to get up there and issue a fatwa, which he did, a religious edict saying that nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction as a whole are against basic Islamic teachings, and that Iran views them as haram or forbidden. You don't make that fatwa and then turn around and violate the fatwa. The bottom line is, do I believe Iran could produce a nuclear weapon today? Yes. I believe the Iranians have the scientific capability to produce a nuclear weapon. These are smart people. And, a nuclear weapon is not, like trying to fly a space capsule to the moon. It can be done. It requires a tremendous amount of dedication and perseverance, which Iran hasn't shown a desire to pursue. And it's all detectable. That's the thing. As a former intelligence officer, I'm here to tell you right now, Iran would not be able to produce a nuclear weapon without the whole world knowing about it. End of story. And so long as Iran is subjected to safeguards inspections by inspectors from the IAEA, and more importantly, if they can ever get the additional protocol inspections back in, Iran will never be able to do this outside of the remit of the inspectors. The fact that we're not raining death and destruction down on Iran is proof positive that we know Iran is not pursuing a nuclear weapon, that the nuclear weapon boogeyman is purely a political device to justify continued economic sanctions.
So, Scott, just recently we saw the chief of the IAEA. He flew to Tehran, he rushed there and struck up this new temporary deal, right? So where Iran will put 3 months worth of data and a surveillance on the side to give a time frame for the U.S. to actually lift sanctions. And if they do, then Iran will hand this data over to the IAEA. If not, it's going to be destroyed, right? So do you think that's a reasonable arrangement? And what do you make of this new law that Iran passed in the Majlis in December, where essentially they're going to limit cooperation for the time being?
At the root of this is the reality that Iran is a democracy. Again, many Western observers, analysts, so-called experts like to think of Iran as a dictatorship where the leader speaks and everything happens. It doesn't work that way. Iran is a vibrant democracy. It's not a perfect democracy, either is the United States, but it is a vibrant democracy that every 4 years elects a parliament that has the ability to pass laws. But the parliament had a major role to play in Iran in the lead up to the JCPOA coming into being. And one of the things the parliament always said, it was basically riffing off of the supreme leader, is that we don't trust the United States. They will violate this. Supreme leader said, I agree, they will violate this. So in order for them to enter the JCPOA, Parliament passed resolutions that said, if the United States violates, then Iran will do X, Y, and Z. And that's what Iran has been doing. So what the Director General went in and said is, if you shut this down, we have to start over from scratch if we come back. We have to undo, 5 years worth of work of accountability. Right now, we know exactly how many centrifuges they have, where they are, et cetera. So the compromise was made that while the data wouldn't be turned over, the data would continue to be collected. And at which time the inspections resume, the additional protocol inspections do, this data would be turned over to the IAEA, which would be able to confirm that, the material balance. So it's a good thing. It's a very good thing. It opens the door and it shows that Iran is willing to keep the door open.
So where do you think this is going ultimately? Because as you said, you don't think the Biden team has any real motive or incentive to rejoin the JCPOA. Some would argue that they've appointed Robert Malley again as the U.S. Special Envoy to Iran. That a lot of the people who are now in the Biden administration, they originally took part in crafting this deal and getting it done. Do you think that they're going to abandon this diplomatic endeavor of theirs so easily? What's their long-term strategy for Iran? Is Iran just going to stay under sanctions for the foreseeable future?
So I think there's a lot of self-delusion taking place within the Biden administration that even if they can't prevail while Rouhani is in power, that there will be an opportunity once a new president is elected to get Iran to come to the table. And that's why they're pumping up, Ali Larijani and his candidacy, and the potential that exists for that. They don't know Ali Larijani if that's what they think. They don't know Iran. They don't know anything if they think this is the case. Iran's policy transcends individuals. People forget that the deal that Rouhani negotiated began under Ahmadinejad. The policy does not change. You just have different people implementing, people who might have more pronounced diplomatic skills, abilities to interface, but it's the same policy. And the policy that's in place today under Rouhani is not Rouhani's policy. It's Iran's policy. And whatever president takes over the reins of executive authority will be implementing this policy, not creating new policy. So I think the Biden administration is fooling itself into believing there might be continued opportunity. I think they think Iran is bluffing. I think we're heading to a situation where Iran is going to cut all relations with the IAEA in regards to the JCPOA and say the agreement is null and void. We're done. Now, that's a risky move on the part of Iran, because the second they do that, there's no going back to that agreement, which they fought so hard to get in place. So that if Iran ever wants to get sanctions lifted, it will have to negotiate a new agreement. That's playing into Biden's hands. So, that mitigates against Iran leaving it indefinitely, but there's not too much more maneuver room for Iran. The parliament has set the 3-month window that happens to coincide with the June presidential election. And I think Biden needs to respect this. If you want the JCPOA to remain, you need to swallow your pride and do an Obama and go to the table, even though it violates all your sense and sensibilities in terms of your long-term policy objectives, and get the agreement back in full force, get the inspectors back in the additional protocol, which is one of the most important things that anybody who believes in nonproliferation should be supporting.
Scott Ritter, thank you so much for your invaluable insight and work. Really appreciate having you on.
Thank you.
Press TV learned that there was a possibility of working out a step-by-step proposal behind the scenes, where if the U.S. took steps to unfreeze Iranian assets, Iran would then take reciprocal steps. But this too was botched, as the Americans insisted that this take place after a sit-down to portray it as some kind of diplomatic win or benevolent act on their part. And the amount discussed was also very low. And when South Korea had agreed to release a portion of Iran's money, billions of dollars, which have been frozen in order to comply with these U.S. sanctions, Secretary of State Blinken quickly balked at the idea. So far, the only difference between the Trump and Biden administrations is that Biden's team say they want to rejoin the JCPOA, but aren't actually doing it. Biden pretends to be diplomatic and like he's reaching out to Iran by offering a sit-down, but he knows that Iran will not accept. And why should they? There's nothing to discuss. The nuclear deal was already concluded in 2015. You either want to be a part of the JCPOA again, like you say, or you don't and you're a liar. How can the United States demand that Iran abide by a deal that the United States itself is not even a party to? A deal that Iran has been abiding by? In what realm does that make any sense? We constantly hear about Iran's, quote, breaching or violations of the nuclear deal. This is dishonest and deceitful language. The mainstream media, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, they all say this in order to vilify Iran. Iran increasing its centrifuges or its enrichment of uranium is not breaching the deal. That's literally part of the deal. Iran is following the dispute mechanism that is integral to the JCPOA. It's written in black and white that Iran can respond to non-compliance and reimposition of sanctions by ceasing to perform its duties in part or in whole. Iran did not tolerate 4 years of Donald Trump's arrogance and terrorism just to be intimidated by Joe Biden or Blinken. Iran has weathered the storm, just like Syria, just like Iraq, and it will continue to do so if it must. For decades now, we've been hearing from Israel, from the United States, from one Secretary of State after the other about how Iran is supposedly weeks away from developing a nuclear bomb. And the media constantly report this as fact without any scrutiny. The same mainstream media and the same politicians who lied about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, who caused a war that killed and displaced millions of Iraqis. How on earth can anyone believe a word that these people say? These are the biggest liars on the face of the planet. Iraq is still under occupation. Iraq still hasn't been built. And now they're off to vilifying other countries, to vilifying Syria and Iran over weapons of mass destruction again. You know, unlike Iran, Israel is not a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and has built a secret stockpile of nuclear weapons. Israel has refused to ratify the Chemical Weapons Convention and drops white phosphorus on Palestinians. Just a few days ago, the United Kingdom announced it will be removing its cap on its nuclear arsenal. In the Pacific Theater, during the final days of World War II, the United States knew Japan was about to surrender and still decided to drop 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians just to send a message to the Soviet Union as a show of force. So let's be frank here. These are the last countries on the face of the planet who should be lecturing Iran about weapons of mass destruction, let alone anyone. This entire power play has nothing to do with nukes. If Iran wanted a nuclear bomb, it would have already built one. This is about dominating and controlling Iran and protecting the interests of the United States and Israel. The rest is just noise. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Richard Medhurst, and this is the Communiqué.